Hi, this is Bonnie, and we are here today to do our 12th Block of the Month Club. I will also be going over different quilting techniques and different styles of quilting techniques to finish your quilt. Today we are going to be doing this block, and it's called the Aztec Jewel. Again, this pattern will be available, posted on the website. When I am finished with this, you can go in, you can look at it, you can print it out. In each section of the pattern, there is a address that you can go in and you can get further explanation of each little technique we're going to do in the quilting. Today, we are simply using a square, a half square triangle, and the face. So these are all patterns that you've had experience with before. I'll go through them all so that you remember how to do them. In this pattern, it will tell you how many units to make of each, how to assemble each unit, which sizes of blocks you need to assemble to get the finished product, and then how to start putting the blocks together. So let's go ahead and get started. Now for today, I have made 4 different color combinations for this block. This is one of the color combination for the Aztec Jewel. Now I've already set this into part of the quilt that I have ready to start putting together. And I have about 6 rows. I was planning on doing 2 sets of 4 to get the length that I wanted. But now I realize that I need 8 sets of 4. So I have a little more piecing to go, but I want it to be long enough that it can be like a bedspread and you tuck it under the pillows. So let me go ahead and just put this to the side right now. Now I'm going to move the camera down so you can see what I have been doing. And I think I just lost all my pieces with this quilt. Well, I can go ahead and I can explain it to you. I'm sorry, I think they got folded up in that other piece. So here we have our quilt block broken down into rows. And now I'm going to camera down so you can see what I've been working on. So on this large plastic sheet, I have assembled the rows that you're going to be sewing together. Now I made sure to follow the pattern that I'm going to get my design going in the correct direction. When I first assembled this, I wasn't looking and I ended up with this point pointing out, but then I had flipped it and you see I'm missing one right there. I'll have to put in. I had flipped it so I had part pointing out and part pointing in. So I had to reassemble it. And all that meant was flip-flopping my row so that I could have them going in the correct direction. So the first row, you'll start out with just a square, a small square. And then you're going to go to a 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangle. Then you're going to do a flying goose, then another rectangle and another square. When you start to sew this, you are going to, and I went ahead and on all of my squares, my 2-inch squares, I did a diagonal line because sometimes they're used for the wings on the flying geese and sometimes they're not. So it's just easier when I cut the squares out that I go ahead and mark them all with that diagonal so I can use them either way. Now, if you remember, when we do a flying goose, we work on the front of the block. We lay our 2.5-inch square on top of our rectangle, and then we sew that we have drawn on that diagonal line. Then we're ready to fold it back and make sure that corners are all even. Once we have done that, then we're ready to clip off our 1/4-inch seam allowance. And then we repeat the process on the other side. I tend to always do the right side first. I guess for you, that would be backwards. I would do the right side first and the left side. And that way I always have my crossing point the same angle. This is always on the top. I have always taken and I have overlapped them in the same direction. So the first row is the square, the rectangle, the flying goose, the rectangle, and the square. The second row is wider. And you see that first I did a half square triangle. And if you remember, you do a half square. Your 3.5-inch square, light square on top of the 3.5-inch dark square. You sew down that center diagonal line. You use that to line up your pressure foot. And then you sew a 1/4 inch in on both sides of that diagonal line. So you have a 1/4 inch on both sides of that seam allowance line. Then you go ahead and you clip the 2 and 2 and open it up. And when you do that, you have a nice half square triangle. And we have done this probably on every single block we have done so far. So this should be a nice review. Also, if you go to your instruction sheet, here it shows us the number of pieces that we cut. Here it shows us how to do a half square triangle, or I mean a flying goose. If you need a refresher, here's a website that you can click on and you can go right through the directions again on how to do a flying goose. Here we have our half square triangle. And if you continue, there will be directions that you can click on to go and review how to do a half square triangle. Each step of the way, there are little reminders that you can go to refresh your mind. So this pattern looks complicated. It's really very simple. The one thing that you're going to need to remember to do as you assemble the pieces, you're going to need to square them up. And by squaring them up, it simply means when you have your piece all finished, you'll need to square it up in the fact that you need to see that this is still a 2-inch square. Here we have, it's a 2-inch square. This is a 2.5 by 2.5 inch square ruler. You're going to need to make sure that your rectangles are completed as 2 by, this one's 3.5 inches. This is your flying goose. After you have it all made, square it up, make sure that it is still 2 by 3.5 inches. If it's not, you might need to trim away a little seam allowance. Don't get wild when you're going to trim up your pieces a little at a time. It's really easy. You know, it's like when you go to the beauty shop to have your hair done and you say, take just a little off the ends. And then you go back and my goodness, they've taken 3.5 inches off. And you go, oh, That's not what I meant. Well, on quilting, it's very much the same way, a little at a time. You can always take a little more off, but you can't put it back on. And it's so frustrating and such a waste of time and materials if you have to recut that piece and then you have to resew it and you have to fit it in, and perhaps you're running short on fabric and you might have to change the whole design out. So it's better if you're squaring up a little at a time, and then you'll make sure that you have your pieces exact. Now, when you are going to sew your pieces together, you're going to want to make sure that you have your seam allowances going in opposite directions. So if this one is pressed under with the seam going to the outside, you're going to want to make that this next row is pressed to make sure that that seam goes in the opposite direction. That way you're going to, as a lineup adjustment, and you can align those, you can align the seams so they're right on each other, but because you rotated your seams and have your seam allowances go in opposite directions, it's going to be a nice flat seam. You won't have this big bulge of fabric. And that just makes so much difference when you go to put those two pieces together. Sometimes as you are working with your fabric and you go to press them together, the fabric almost dictates which direction it would like to be pressed in. And that's how it is with this fabric. Even though these are all 100% cotton, the weaves are a little bit different. This off-white is a more open weave. It's a softer, more flowing fabric, where this blue fabric, it's a tighter woven fabric. So this is going to take control. It's going to want to be the boss, and it's going to want to tell you which direction you should do your pressing. It's very strange all the time. And here I have my seams pressed in opposite directions. I line up my stitching line, pin it with a pin, and then sew my 1/4 inch right along. Be careful that you don't hit the pins or the needle of your sewing machine on the pin. Sometimes the machine needle will jump over it, the pin, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes tip, or you have a broken needle or a bent needle. So you would stitch right up till you get to where that pin is, and then you'll stop and then slide your pin out and then continue your sewing. So part of your stitching is held with the pins until you need it, and then make sure that you get a nice even seam and that it goes across this extra and you have a nice flat seam. And you're going to do this with each row. So when you get your first 2 rows together and you have your seam allowances one way or the other, then you can go and flip your other pieces over and you can press them, match these two, so that you're always staggering the seam one way or the other. And that works out very nicely, that you do 2 rows and then that dictates how the rest of the seams will be pressed the rest of the way down. It's so funny. I wonder from when I finished, I said, oh, look, I have an extra piece, and so I put it in my pin caddy that's right beside my machine, and now I can just go and get it and sew it back on. And see, as many times as I've done quilt piecing, I still go back thing. I think quilt mental activity, it keeps your brain sharp. So here we have another color combination. Remember, this our first color combination. And this is color combination 2. This color combination 3. And then I have number 4 in the other room where I'm sewing more strips. So depending on the colors you use, you can completely change the look of these blocks. So this is the 12th block. And as I promised, these would be done in time that you can still get the quilt quilted. Either you can do it yourself, or you can take it to someone and have it professionally quilted, but you'll have it for a Christmas gift. So let's go ahead and let's look at some different ways you might like to finish your quilt. Remember, as I've mentioned before, use a neutral color thread. This blends in with the lights, it blends in with the dark. It's not shocking against the lights and it's not shocking against the darks. It just blends in and makes a nice color. Another neutral color, there's so many different grays. You might choose to use gray. I would stay away from white, and I would stay away from the dark navy or dark brown. I would just stay a nice medium color. So this one is the one we've been working on. And I think you might remember that I wanted to do stars because I'm such a star. I wanted to do a star in between each block section. So in order to do that, I had to do some thinking. And here I thought, when I did it on my first quilt, I was so excited. I thought that I had developed a new quilting technique. And then it turns out, no, it's an old one. It's not a new invention. It's an old one. So in order to do this, my blocks are 12.5 inches square, or inches long, by 3 inches wide, by 3 inches wide. And then I took my 2-inch squares and I did a flying geese ends of that 12.5 inch square on the end. Now, I do not like when a star or a design just gets cut off at the border. So then I had to figure out, now I want to put my other 2 little star points into my border fabric. So what I did, 3.5 inches long. I cut 3.5 inch blue squares, and then I took my 2-inch blue, or my 2-inch white petals or white points. I sewed them on to that blue square and goose, and then my border in between, let's go this way. My border in between is again that 12.5 inches until I get to the next points for the star. And I did that all the way around. And this is a quilt that I did earlier for the library. And this I used all Civil War reproduction fabrics in. And we were doing a project at that point on Laura Ingalls Wilder. And this is when I thought I had discovered the star pattern. in between the squares. And here we have, this is what it looks like. Now, if you want to do additional borders on this one, I just had the blue be my border and my finishing of my star pieces. You see there's a piece set in here, You can't even tell it was with that border. And then I just had it bound in, I used a plain blue backing, and that was the border, so they match. And then my binding is also made out of that same navy blue. I had it professionally quilted, was done on a machine. It has a pattern to do all over the entire. Now, this is a sample of some different techniques you might like to use. Now, you notice that I have my quilt, and then I have my backing. And this is a piece of polyester batting. And I, as a rule, don't use total polyester. I like a combination of cotton and polyester, but this one is polyester. So let me show you the difference. So this was a 9 patch, and this one I decided to tie, and I have another quilt I'll show you in a minute. I decided to tie. So what I did, I made a sandwich, and that's what it's called, a quilt sandwich. You put your backing with the pretty side down, then your backing on top, and then your front. You take pins or safety pins, whichever you decide to use, and you pin through all the layers. You start in the center and you work out. You make sure that all 3 layers of your quilt sandwich stay nice and flat. You work out from that center point. If you're doing a whole quilt, you might want to do, say, 3 ties down the center, and then you just keep working out, and that keeps your quilt nice and fabric, or nice and flat. Yarn, I like embroidery floss. I take a large darning needle. I take a stitch through all to bunch it up so that I can work my needle through. Yes, you'll get a lot of pokes on that finger. You might, I have some leather thimbles, good for quilting, and you put your finger underneath and you take your stitch through. So this border on this one is just a very plain flat border. I did the pieces down the side, and I did pieces across the top. Where they join, it's just a flat seam. Perhaps I would want to do a mitered corner, and that's when you would take your fabric and you would cut your 2 pieces at a 90-degree angle. You have that nice little V that you see in quilts, and I'll show you one of those in a second. But this one I just did flat. Now, perhaps you want to do fancy corners, and you do little checkers. You take and you do, this is called strip quilting for this. You'll do a strip of 3 different colors, and you'll sew a long, long strip. And this one, you would do 3 strips, 2 colors the same, 1 different in the middle. And you would make long, long strips. And then you would take and slip strips in the width that you want them, and be sure to allow for your seam allowance on both sides. And then you can sew them together. Another fun corner is just a square of fabric. And you just cut a coordinating fabric. Very, very simple one to do. And of course, mine with the stars is a little more complicated. Now there's different, this one you would not quilt at all because you have tied it. And you want to make sure that your ties go, depending on how thick your batting is, every 4 inches all the way around, maybe every 6. These I just did a stitch in the center of each, and that makes a nice, it holds it nicely, holds it tight. It doesn't bunch up and make it bulky. Now, another style of quilting would be this wall hanging, and this is called echo quilting. Now, this is done entirely by hand, this piece, and you see that I sewed my little strips together, and then down the center of each stitch or each strip, I hand quilted little tiny stitches. This is called a form of echo quilting. When you just follow the line of the fabric, you follow the line of the piecing, and you just put it very close to the seam, and that's echo quilting. This one has, it has 2 different borders. It has the cream color border and then the navy blue color. And then this one I actually bound. Okay, this one I actually took the fabric that I did the sashing with, and I rolled it over and put it over the backing. And then I hand stitched it down. Another style you might like be a combination of styles. This one I hand tied it. This has polyester. This one I repeated a way of quilting that my grandmother did, and I'll show you one of her quilts in a second. And she actually took embroidery and did embroidery stitches around each one of these pieces. This is an applique quilt. This I did for my oldest son when he was born, because I didn't know if it was a boy or girl. We had boys and girls, Sunbonnet Sue and Rainbow Boy, I think were the titles. But anyway, this one I actually used purchase seam binding on, and I will never use purchase seam binding again. It puckered, it didn't want to sew on. I had to baste it, it just didn't work well. So from now on, I cut my own bindings. They're strips cut on a 90-degree angle. Now here we have, this is the one that my grandmother did. And you see we had these little tiny embroidery stitches that hold it all the way around. And then she tied it. She used a very thin batting. My guess is it was a sheet or a piece of fabric in there. There's no fluff to it. She did a quilt like this for each one of the grandchildren when they turned 12 years old. Unfortunately, at that time, I didn't realize how long it took to do a quilt, or all these little patterns are clothing that I remember. I had a dress made out of this. My mother had an apron made out of this. My aunt had a dress made out of this. So she would take all of the fabrics from where all of them sewed, and she would do it. And this is called a crazy quilt. There's actually a piece of white old sheeting underneath, and she would take and pin the pieces down and roll the edges over the top of the next piece, pin it down, and then do this stitching. So this was called a crazy quilt. And then this is another one that's completely done by hand. And this is called the Wood Lily design. Aha! I knew I'd find it. There it is. And this one, I did the triangles, a 90-degree triangle. And then I did 3 bindings. I did the 3 colors that I used in the entire quilt. And I bound it with the rose color, and then the backing is a print that is the rose, the blue, and the off-white, and there's a light blue in there. So there's many, many different ways that you can finish a quilt, that you can bind off a quilt. Take a look in different quilting books, see what catches your fancy. Also, it might be determined on how much matching coordinating fabric you have left over. So just have fun with it, experiment with it. Yes, you're probably going to have to tear something out and redo it. And that's all part of the learning process and learning to do it correctly and as you want it. There's really no right or wrong to quilting. You have your pieces fit together and just explore that wonderful world of quilting. Now, we will be putting anyone's quilt on display in the activity room at the library that when you finish it. If you just want to finish your quilt top and bring it in before you have bound it into a quilt, that's just fine too. We would love to display it. So happy quilting. I hope that you've learned a lot this last year. You have lots of new patterns to experiment with, and maybe there's one pattern in particular you like, and you want to do your whole quilt over that pattern, and that's fine too. I like samplers and I like stars. So enjoy, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.